So far, we have learned how to use Java servlets to create web applications. In theory, servlets can be used to create any web application. But after a few homework and labs, you'll probably realize that it doesn't seem to be a good idea to use servlets to generate HTML pages. In particular, using the print method to write HTML is very tedious and error-prone. Because in Servlet, HTML text is treated as Java strings, it's very easy to forget to escape a code or miss a closing tag, and there's no syntax highlighting or auto error detection to help you. Also, both the code for processing and the code for display are mixed together. So if you work in a team where there are graphic designers to design the user interface, those designers will have to know Java to create the design, instead of using tools that they are familiar with, like Dreamweaver. This problem is not limited to Java. In fact, all web technologies must deal with the same problem, that is how to generate HTML in an efficient way. Whether you are using Java or ASP or PHP or something else, the solution turns out to be the same. Use a HTML page as a template, and then add code to the page to produce dynamic content. In Java, this is called Java Server Page or JSP. A JSP can contain only HTML content. Let's look at a quick example. So we can create a JSP file, and it can be a simple file just with the JSP suffix. And just like a regular HTML page, we can have the HTML tag, the head, and the body, and some content in it. And this page, just like a regular HTML page, can be accessed by mapping the request URI to a file on disk. So currently this file is under web content, so the URL would be hello jsp.jsp. And we see the output here. In this case, of course, the content is static. No matter how many times we refresh this page, it always shows the current time is 6 p.m. And that's simply because we only have HTML content in there. So let's say that we want the JSP to produce some dynamic content, and all we need to do is to add some code to it. For example, instead of hard code 6 p.m., we can say something like and now it shows the current time. And even better, if we refresh, notice that the time will change. And it's reflecting the actual current time. And this is, of course, the dynamic part. So how does JSP work? It turns out that it has something to do with servlets. In fact, behind the scene, the application server automatically converts a JSP to a servlet, compiles it, and basically runs it as a servlet. To see this, you can look under this folder, under the Tomcat server where your application is deployed. For Eclipse, the directory where your application is deployed is actually not the project folder. For example, here, my project is CS320, and this is the workspace, and this is my project folder, which has the build, source, web content, and so on. And Eclipse actually doesn't run the project within this project folder. It deploys the project to an Eclipse controlled server, and that server is located under this folder. So go to your workspace folder, then .metadata, .plugins, and then org eclipse wst server core, and then temp0. And this is the Eclipse controlled Tomcat folder. And this folder is called temp0. If you have created multiple Tomcat runtime in your Eclipse, you may also see folders like temp1, temp2, and so on. So if you look under this folder and then WTP web apps, this is where your project is deployed. So to look for the servlets converted from JSP, go to temp0, work, Catalina, localhost, and then the application name. There will be subdirectories under this because the directory structure must match the package name of the classes. Keep going, you'll find the servlet converted from the JSP here. And this is a servlet converted from our JSP page. Notice that this JSP is called hello.jsp.jsp, and this automatically generated servlet is hello.jsp_jsp.java. There are a few things worth noting here. First, the class inherits from HTTP JSP base, which is this one. And this class is a subclass of HTTP servlet, which makes this class a servlet itself. Also notice that most of the processing is done in this method, _JSP service. This method has a request parameter and a response parameter, just like doGet and doPost. You might be wondering how one method like this can handle both GET and POST requests. Remember that in this method you have access to HTTP request, so you can always call request_get method, then do a if-else statement based on the request method to handle any type of request, whether it's GET or POST or delete or put or whatever. One last thing to notice is that all the HTML text here in our JSP page are converted to out.write statements, so we don't have to do this ourselves. This is quite a relief. And if, for example, we add a little bit here that says hello JSP, and refresh, it shows here. And notice that there's no hello JSP right now. And we reload the file and notice that this one comes right here. Okay. So we no longer have to manually code this write or print statements ourselves. The server automatically generates this code for us based on the HTML text we put into the JSP, and that's really nice. So going back to JSP, what we have seen in the example is just a small part of what JSP can do. In addition to HTML template text, we can include a number of Java code elements in JSP to generate dynamic content. In this lesson, we'll discuss directives, comments, and scripting elements. And in later lessons, we'll cover beans, expression language, and custom tag libraries. This is the syntax of directives. You'll need to specify a type and then some attributes. Now let's create a JSP with Eclipse and see what the page directive is used for. So right-click on Web Content and then select New JSP File, and it will ask you where to put the JSP file and the name of the JSP file. Let's just call it JSP test. Now, here you can choose a template for your JSP, and there are a lot to choose from. You should choose either the one that JSP with HTML markup or JSP with XHTML markup, because HTML and XHTML are the formats that we are familiar with. Don't choose the rest of them because they use XML syntax or Java server faces tags that we won't cover. So most of the time I like to use XHTML format. As we can see here, Eclipse automatically includes a page directive here. Notice that the type of the directive is page, and other than page, there are a couple of other directive types. One is include and one is tag lib, and we'll cover those two directives in later lessons. As you can see here, page directive is mostly used to provide some information about the page, such as content type, page encoding, and so on. Page directive is not required. For example, this JSP page doesn't have it, but it's nice to have it if you need to specify certain things, such as content type and page encoding. Page directives can also be used for some other purposes, like importing some Java packages for scripting elements, which we'll discuss in a moment, or disable the use of session for a page. Overall, it's called page directive because it specifies information that affects a single JSP page. In JSP, you can use two types of comments, the regular HTML comments and the JSP comments. Let's see an example. So going back to my simple page, actually, let's copy over this page directive so that this example would include everything. And so in JSP, you can use regular HTML comments with bracket, exclamation mark, and then some HTML comments. And you can also use JSP comments, which use a different syntax. And so this is a JSP comment. Now, if you look at the generated HTML output, none of these comments are showing. But if you do a view source, you can see that the HTML comment is shown here, because in JSP, HTML content is treated the same as other HTML text, so it will be printed out, and any user can see these comments. However, notice that the JSP comments are not shown, which means that you should use JSP comments if you want to have some comments for other developers instead of your end users. After comments, we have the scripting elements, which include JSP Expression, JSP Scriptlet, and JSP Declaration. First, we need to understand what is an expression. This concept is kind of important because later we'll also talk about something called expression language. As we can see here, there are usually lots of things in a programming language, from comments to values to variables and types, and all the way to more complex things like functions, methods, classes, packages, and so on. Expressions are basically anything that evaluates to a single value. For example, 1 by itself is an expression because it is a single value. A variable by itself would also be an expression because it also evaluates to a single value. And a plus b minus c is an expression. A plus b double equals to c. This is also an expression because notice that it evaluates to a single Boolean value of true or false. But if it's something like if a plus b equals to c, then do something else, then this is no longer an expression. It's now a statement. So back to JSP, we can include a Java expression using JSP expression. Notice the syntax is bracket, percentage sign, equal, and then percentage sign closing the bracket. JSP expressions will be converted to some expressions inside the out.write method in JSP service method, as we've seen here. Actually, it goes inside the print, but in either case, it prints out for the HTTP response. So, knowing that, let's modify our add example and see how I can use JSP expression. Remember that our add example adds two request parameters together and display the sum. So let's create that. Let's create add JSP. So we'll call it add JSP, and here we'll say something like the sum of A and B is something. Okay. Okay, so this is the part what we call HTML template text. So this is responsible for displaying the JSP page, but we do need to add the dynamic part to it. So how do we get the value of a request parameter? Well, how about request get parameter A, and request that parameter B. Notice two things here. First of all, this method called getParameter A and getParameter B returns a single value. So let's make this whole thing an expression, which we can put inside a JSP expression. Now the second thing is arguably more important, is the use of the request variable here. Notice that we never declare a request variable anywhere, but somehow we can call request get parameter. Now the reason for this becomes clear if we look at the servlet converted from the JSP. So for example here, notice that there are already a number of variables like request, response, config, application, session, page context, and so on defined here. And these are known as predefined variables, and you can use them directly in the JSP in the same way that you use them in servlets, because after all, JSP are converted to servlets. So here, we know that request is a predefined variable along with response, out, session, application, and a few others. So we can simply say request get parameter, just like what we would do in a servlet. So this would give us the value of A parameter, B parameter. We still need to add them up, and we'll do something similar as before. We'll say integer dot pass int request get parameter A plus just this part. And this should do it. Let's see, we'll do add.jsp, and A is 10 and B is 20. It shows the sum of 10 and 20 is 30. If we change B to 40, and the result changes. And very simple example to show the use of JSP expression, and also understand what expression is. As long as this thing looks, it eventually evaluates to a single value, so this whole thing, although it kind of looks complex, is still an expression, and we can embed that into a JSP page using JSP expression. And we can take a quick look at the generated servlet file, which is here. Notice that we have one more file now. And as we can see here, all the JSP expressions become the argument to the out.print method here, and then this is a to integer pass int, and there won't be any error for using the request variable, because this request variable is already declared here. Okay, so JSP expressions only let us specify expressions, and sometimes we want to write actual code, and that's where Scriptlet comes in. Again, pay attention to the syntax. Notice that here there's no equal sign comparing to JSP expression, and using JSP Scriptlet, we can insert any code inside the JSP service method, which is the method in the generated servlet class. So with that knowledge, let's try to add some code to our add.jsp so that it checks whether the parameters are specified or not. If the parameters are not specified, we want to redirect the user to add form.html. Without that part, if the user, for example, forgot to provide a parameter, then it won't work. So what do we do here? We add some additional code, and it doesn't really matter where you add the code. Remember, all this HTML text will become the arguments to out.write. So if we put the additional code here, that's equivalent to inserting some code here. And so we can do something like this. We'll say, what do we say here? We'll say string A is request get parameter A, string B is B, and we'll say if A is null or A is empty, or B is null or B is empty, we do a response send redirect, and we redirect it to add form.html, and just like what we did before, don't forget to return here, and then after that we can simply say this is A because we declared a string variable A, this is B because we declare B here, and this is integer pass int A, and this is integer pass int B. Okay, so let's see if this thing works, and let's say we provide both parameters first. Works fine. And let's say if we provide only one parameter, it sends us to the add form, and add form currently is submitting the form to the add servlet. Then let's change it to submitting to JSP. Notice that the method here is post, and let's refresh this. It's going to add.jsp. Now, if we don't provide, let's say we provide only a parameter, add, send it back. And if we provide both parameters, it shows 11, 22 is 33, add.jsp. Right? So everything is working properly. And again, let's take a look at the generated servlet code, and notice that for the so-called scriptlets, the code that we added here, and those scriptlets becomes code inside the JSP service method. So here we have the string AB, we have the redirect, and then we have the variable A, variable B, passing A, passing the B here. As you can see, there's a pretty straightforward mapping from the scriptlets and the JSP expression to the code generated inside the servlet. So if you understand servlet, it's pretty easy to understand how this thing works. With the JSP scriptlet, sometimes you can do rather tricky things like this. For example, try to see if you can understand what this piece of code is doing. So notice that this part is a JSP scriptlet, and it's part of an if statement. And then this line is HTML text, which gets converted into something like out.write, and then this one, right? And then this is another piece of the if-else statement, and another output, another piece of the if statement. So this one basically says that generate a random number, and if the random number is less than 0.5, print out have a nice day, and otherwise print out have a lousy day. To write code like this is definitely not good programming practice, because the code, as you can see, is very hard to read and very hard to understand. But syntactically, this is something you can do, and it's perfectly fine, at least in terms of syntax. The last scripting element is JSP Declaration. Notice the exclamation mark here. You can use JSP declaration to specify code that goes outside the JSP service method. Notice that the scripting elements goes inside the method, and sometimes you may want to add some code that goes outside this method, and you can do that with JSP declarations. And for this example, we'll redo our request counter example in JSP. Remember that in order to count the number of requests, we need a class variable, and that class variable obviously needs to be declared outside the JSP service method, and we can do that using JSP declaration. So let's create something like that, and we'll say request counter.jsp, and request counter here, and we'll say, what do I say here? We say you are visitor number counter. And counter here is not declared yet, and we'll declare that, and we do that with JSP declaration. We'll say int counter and initialize it to 0. And after we show the counter value, we'll have to increment it, and we know that we can do it with a scriptlet, and this will be something like ++ counter. Okay, so let's try this. Request counter.jsp. Your visitor number 0, refresh, number 1, refresh, number 2. Using a different browser, number 3, number 4, and so it goes. And very quickly, let's see the generated servlet class. So notice that the JSP declaration part, this part, is in here, and notice that it's outside the JSP service method here, and inside the JSP service method, we have the output, which says your visitor number something, and there's a print, and there's also the incrementing of the counter, which corresponds to the JSP scriptlet here. So this is more or less a story about JSP scripting elements, and there are a few things I want to point out. First of all, the term JSP scripting elements refer to 3 things: JSP expression, JSP scriptlet, and JSP declaration. Please remember this, and do not ask later if JavaScript or expression is considered a JSP scripting element. They are not. Only these 3 things are JSP scripting elements. Also, as we have seen so far, there's a straightforward mapping between JSP with scripting elements and the servlet code generated from that. So if you already know servlet, it's quite easy to learn scripting elements and create JSPs like this instead of writing servlets. However, there are some problems with scripting elements, as shown in this example. JSP code with scripting elements is very hard to read, hard to debug, and hard to maintain. The reason is, once again, we are mixing presentation code, or in other words, the HTML code, with processing code, or in other words, the Java code. Remember that at the beginning, one of the reasons why we moved from servlet to JSP is because we want to separate presentation from processing. But with scripting elements, we kind of end up with the same problem, except that instead of embedding HTML in Java, we are now embedding Java in HTML. It can be just as bad as before. And on top of that, we lose some capability of reusing code, because unlike classes, you cannot reuse code embedded in a JSP in some other places. So the bottom line is, although it's important that you know about scripting elements, you should not use them in your web applications. In the next couple of lessons, we'll introduce other JSP elements that create much better separation between presentation and processing. Remember, don't use JSP scripting elements.